Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. This audio uses AI narration to present our original book analysis. Today we're diving deep into George Lakoff's Whose Freedom? So if you're looking for a clear and concise overview of this dense book, well, you've come to the right place. This book explores how Americans view the concept of freedom. And it goes beyond just the philosophical arguments. Lakoff digs into the psychology, the frameworks that really shape this whole debate.
Yeah, it's a fascinating approach. He doesn't just lay out arguments, He brings in cognitive science, uses real-world examples to show us how our brains actually grasp abstract ideas like freedom.
It's interesting, he even uses the word brains, right? He argues that the right's repetitive use of the word freedom is strategic. It's not just about persuasion in the moment. It's about actually changing how people think about it long term.
Exactly. And one of the key points he makes is how our physical experiences shape our understanding of freedom. Think about the feeling of being trapped or imprisoned, that visceral sense of being held back.
It's powerful, right? It connects the idea of freedom to our bodies, to something deeply personal.
And that personal connection is what makes this concept so potent in politics.
Okay, so let's talk about how this plays out politically. Because at the most basic level, there has to be some common ground on freedom, right?
There is. Lakoff calls it simple freedom. Things like, avoiding harm or coercion. Those are universally understood as violating freedom.
Makes sense.
But then things get a lot more complicated when you start looking at more nuanced areas.
Right, like competition in the free market, ideas around fairness, even the role of nature. Those aren't as clear-cut.
Exactly. And to illustrate how these values diverge, he uses this really interesting metaphor. He talks about the strict father and the nurturant parent family models.
I like that. It's a great way to capture the core values driving each side's understanding of freedom. It's like two different blueprints for raising kids, but applied to society as a whole.
Right. So the strict father model emphasizes individual responsibility, discipline. That pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. Freedom in this framework is about the absence of external constraint.
Fewer regulations, less government intervention.
Exactly.
It's that classic don't tread on me view of freedom.
Now contrast that with the nurturant parent model. This one focuses on empathy care and social responsibility. It argues that for people to truly be free, certain conditions need to be met. And that requires positive action, like ensuring access to education or health care.
So things like public education, social safety nets, universal health care, these aren't seen as handouts in this framework. They're seen as essential tools for creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to actually exercise their freedom.
It's not just about being left alone. It's about having the resources and support to thrive.
And this distinction, I think, is crucial for understanding how each side approaches so many hot-button issues. Everything from the economy and social programs to even environmental regulations.
Yeah.
And Lakoff doesn't shy away from those tough topics. He goes right to the heart of debates around healthcare, climate change, even the role of religion in public life.
Yeah.
Showing how these seemingly separate issues are actually all interconnected by these underlying frameworks of freedom.
And he also explores how each side uses the concept of causation to support their arguments. Progressives often emphasize systemic causation, looking at the complex web of factors that contribute to social problems.
Right.
While conservatives tend to focus on direct causation, holding individuals solely accountable for their circumstances.
Yeah, and this difference is especially stark when you look at debates over poverty. The strict father model might say, if you're poor, it's because you didn't work hard enough. While the nurturant parent model would consider things like lack of access to education, affordable housing, job opportunities.
And that brings us to another powerful tool that both sides use. Populism.
Right, but they frame it in very different ways.
Conservative populism tends to paint progressives as elitist and out of touch. Lakoff actually argues that progressives need to develop their own brand of populism.
Interesting.
A populism that speaks to the concerns of ordinary Americans, highlighting how progressive policies can actually benefit them, and emphasizing the real threats posed by certain conservative policies to core freedoms.
So it's about showing how progressive values actually align with the everyday experiences of many people, even those who might traditionally identify as conservative.
Exactly.
This leads us to Lakoff's critique of what he calls the economic liberty myth. This idea that unfettered free markets inherently lead to more freedom for everyone.
He argues that this often serves corporate interests rather than individual liberty. Think about the cheap labor trap. This relentless pursuit of the lowest possible wages might benefit corporations, but it traps millions of Americans in a cycle of poverty and limited opportunity.
So he's challenging us to rethink these deeply ingrained assumptions about economic freedom. He's saying, look, if people can't afford basic necessities, if they're working multiple jobs just to survive, are they really free?
It's a crucial question. It's about reframing that whole debate. Instead of focusing solely on corporate profits and deregulation, we should be talking about fair wages, workers' rights, and the government's role in ensuring a level playing field.
Yeah.
Where everyone has a genuine chance to succeed.
It's about recognizing that true economic freedom requires more than just the absence of government interference. It requires a system that provides opportunities for all, not just a select few.
Right. And, Lakoff doesn't shy away from one of the most sensitive topics in American politics, the religious divide.
It's a complaints landscape for sure.
He explores how contrasting views on God and morality and the role of religion in public life all shape our understanding of freedom.
Deeply held beliefs on both sides.
Absolutely. He delves into what he calls progressive Christianity and conservative Christianity, highlighting their different interpretations of faith and how those interpretations influence their political stances.
So how do those interpretations actually play out in the real world?
Well, it affects how each side approaches issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, even the role of prayer in schools.
And Lakoff argues that conservative Christians have been very effective in framing these issues in terms of religious freedom,
often portraying themselves as victims of a secular society that's trying to silence their beliefs.
and that framing has been powerful.
It has allowed conservatives to gain significant political power, shaping public policy, influencing court decisions on issues ranging from reproductive rights to school curriculum.
But Lakoff is also critical of progressives here. He says they're sometimes hesitant to even engage in these debates.
And by avoiding discussions about religion and values, he argues that progressives cede ground to conservatives, allowing them to define what it means to be a moral American.
It's like they're forfeiting the debate before it even begins.
In a way, and he challenges progressives to be more vocal about their own values, even when those values clash with certain religious beliefs.
To stand up for what they believe in.
Exactly. He reminds us that the separation of church and state isn't about being anti-religion. It's about ensuring that everyone has the freedom to practice their faith or no faith without government interference.
Freedom of conscience for everyone.
Right, and this leads us to what Lakoff calls the war on truth.
Okay, so what does he mean by that?
He argues that the right has been incredibly successful in using distorted facts, misleading language, sometimes even outright lies to advance their agenda and undermine their opponents.
And we see this play out in so many areas. Debates over climate change, evolution, even basic economic facts.
It's not just about spin. It's about creating an alternative reality where facts are malleable and truth is whatever serves their political goals.
So he's saying it's a deliberate attempt to manipulate reality.
It can feel that way, and he gives some pretty chilling examples of how this manipulation works.
Like what?
Well, he points to the use of intelligent design to challenge the theory of evolution in schools, a tactic designed to undermine scientific evidence and inject religious beliefs into public education.
It's a way of blurring the lines between science and faith.
Exactly. Or think about the constant denial of climate change despite overwhelming scientific consensus.
These aren't just intellectual debates. They have real-world consequences.
Absolutely. They're attacks on the very foundations of a shared reality, making it harder and harder to have honest, productive conversations about the challenges facing our society.
And that erosion of trust has ripple effects.
It erodes trust in institutions, fuels political polarization, makes it much more difficult to find common ground on critical issues.
So what's the antidote to this war on truth?
Well, Lakoff warns against what he calls the rationalist mistake.
Which is?
The belief that simply presenting facts will be enough to persuade people who hold opposing views.
Oh, I see. So just laying out the evidence isn't enough.
It's not that simple, he argues, that this ignores the power of emotion values and those deeply ingrained worldviews that shape how we interpret information.
It's not enough to be right. You have to understand the psychology.
And Lakoff's book is more than just an analysis of the problem. He actually offers a way forward.
So what are some of his solutions?
Well, he provides specific strategies for communicating more effectively, building coalitions, and challenging the dominant frames that have allowed conservatives to gain so much ground.
It's about fighting back strategically.
He reminds us that language is incredibly powerful. It can be used to liberate or oppress, to illuminate or to deceive.
And it's up to each of us to choose how we will wield that power.
Lakoff challenges progressives to be more strategic, more aware of the subtle ways in which language can be used to shape our thinking.
Give me an example.
Sure, instead of talking about estate taxes, which evokes images of wealthy heirs, talk about the inheritance tax, emphasizing that it only applies to a tiny fraction of the population.
It's about framing the issue in a way that resonates with more people.
Exactly. Or instead of debating climate change, which can feel abstract and distant, talk about global warming pollution, directly connecting the issue to threats to people's health and well-being.
It's about making it personal.
He also stresses the importance of building a strong progressive infrastructure. Think tanks, media outlets, grassroots organizations that can effectively counter conservative narratives and offer a compelling alternative vision for the future.
It's about creating a powerful counterweight to the well-funded, highly organized conservative media machine.
Right. And most importantly, he calls on individuals to become more aware of the frames that shape their own thinking and to actively choose the vision of freedom that aligns with their values.
Because ultimately, the battle for freedom is not just a political struggle. It's a battle for hearts and minds. It's a battle for the very soul of our nation.
It's about recognizing that we all operate within certain frames, and those frames influence how we see the world.
If we're not aware of those frames, we're less free than we think we are.
Yeah, it's like wearing glasses without realizing it. The world looks a certain way because of those lenses. And we might not even question whether there's another way to see things.
And Lakoff argues that conservatives have been much more effective at understanding and utilizing these frames. They've invested heavily in building a narrative, a consistent story about America. That resonates with a lot of people.
Right. They tap into those deeply held values: individual responsibility, self-reliance, limited government. These ideas, they speak to a powerful longing for freedom from outside control.
But he argues that it's a very specific kind of freedom, one that often benefits those who are already in positions of power, while ignoring the systemic factors that limit freedom for many others.
And this is where progressives often struggle. They might have great ideas, but they sometimes get bogged down in policy details, or they focus too much on what divides them, instead of finding that unifying narrative.
So it's about more than just having the right policies. It's about telling the right story.
Exactly, and Lakoff challenges progressives to be bolder, to reclaim the concept of freedom, and show how their policies actually expand opportunities and empower people.
To connect with people on an emotional level.
He argues that progressives need to get better at telling their own story, connecting their ideas to values like fairness, compassion, community. These are values that resonate deeply with many Americans, even those who might not identify as liberal.
So it's not just about winning arguments, it's about changing hearts and minds. It's about painting a picture of a future where everyone has a chance to thrive.
Absolutely. And Lakoff offers some concrete steps for how to do this. He stresses the importance of building a strong progressive infrastructure. Think tanks, media outlets, grassroots organizations that can challenge the conservative narrative and offer a compelling alternative vision for the future.
So it's about investing in the long game, creating a movement that can shift the political landscape, not just win a few elections.
Right. He also emphasizes the importance of training progressive leaders to be more effective communicators. It's not enough to just have good ideas. You have to be able to explain those ideas in a way that connects with people emotionally.
You have to make them feel it.
Exactly. And he encourages progressives to use techniques like reframing, finding ways to talk about issues that resonate with people's values and experiences.
So instead of getting defensive about taxes, progressives can talk about investments in education, infrastructure, social programs.
Right. Or instead of debating government regulation, they can talk about protecting consumers, workers, and the environment.
It's about changing the language, changing the frame, and ultimately changing the way people think about these issues.
Lakoff's Whose Freedom is a powerful call to action. It's a challenge to think critically about the forces that shape our understanding of freedom. It's a reminder that we're not just passive recipients of information. We have the power to choose the frames we use, the stories we tell, and ultimately the kind of society we want to create.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into Whose Freedom. So much to think about. What stood out to you in this exploration of freedom? How does it impact your thinking, your choices, your actions in the world?
Lakoff reminds us that freedom isn't a static concept. It's something we constantly negotiate and redefine. It's a struggle that requires ongoing engagement, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge the frames that limit our understanding and our possibilities.
If you're ready to delve deeper into Lakoff's analysis and explore his strategies for reclaiming freedom, we highly encourage you to pick up a copy of Whose Freedom. You can find a link to purchase the book in the episode description. While you're there, hit that subscribe button to join us for more insightful deep dives that cut through the noise and give you the knowledge you crave.